Mr. President, I want to talk about the disaster funding debate that's going on this week.
Without objection.
I appreciate your recognition. And this is a debate that has become the debate as part of the Burma Sanctions Act, which if we were been debating the Burma Sanctions Act, I'd also be for Burma sanctions. But in this debate on disasters, Missouri's played an unfortunate leading role in disasters this year of all kinds. We've had floods along the Mississippi River. We've had floods along the Missouri River. Joplin, Missouri, one of the bigger cities in our state, was hit by a tornado. We've evacuated a place in southeast Missouri, a floodway called Bird's Point, where for the first time since 1937, the Corps of Engineers decided that 130 or so thousand acres had to be used as a floodway. All the crops that were already planted and up obviously destroyed as part of that. I was in that floodway for a couple of different days in August, and I will say the resilience of Missouri farmers to get about 80% of that floodway back in soybeans means the economic loss, crop loss, won't be what it was, but the recovery loss is substantial, as is the cost of rebuilding that levee back to the level it was before the Corps exercised a long plan that hadn't been used to take it down. Tornadoes struck St. Louis at the airport and around Lambert Field, in communities around Lambert Field. Tornadoes in Joplin were significant. I've mentioned on the floor before of the Senate that I lived close to Joplin. It was in my congressional district for 14 years. I had an office there. I'm probably as familiar with Joplin as anybody that doesn't live there or hasn't lived there. And as I went to the scene of this tornado, Mr. President, the devastation made a city that I was very, very familiar with, at least a half-mile path, 6 miles across that city, virtually unrecognizable by me or the local police officer that was driving me around. There were no street signs left. Every block looked like the block on either side of it. An incredible amount of devastation. There were 141 people killed, either at the time of the tornado or who within a few days of the tornado died as a result of the injuries. 900 people were injured. A hospital that was destroyed that'll cost about $500 million to replace. The high school was destroyed. The Votech school was destroyed. Lots of elementary schools destroyed. 500 commercial properties. 8,000 apartments and homes. And I think destroyed in virtually all those cases would be the right word. Some of them salvageable, most of them not. Homes, churches, elementary schools, the Catholic school, all destroyed by that tornado. And while we make headway every day finding housing for people in that community that were affected by the loss of those 8,000 homes, and while the schools were up and running by the day schools were scheduled to start 90 days later, in an incredible way, just looking for whatever space was available and turning that into schools for this year. There's clearly a lot to be done, and this exceeds the capacity of an individual community or even a state to do what needs to be done. Now, I'm in the process and have been for some time now of discussing with GSA the exact right request to be sure that we're not declaring disasters as national disasters that aren't national in scope, that we haven't gotten into a habit of just saying, well, that's a disaster, the governor ought to send a request to the president and the president ought to grant it, and we don't want to be doing that when a state or a community really could handle the problem. But we do always want to be sure that we have the resources necessary when states and communities can't possibly handle this kind of problem by themselves. The tornado I talked about was one. Flooding in the entire Mississippi Valley watershed, which is, I think, the fourth largest watershed in the world, and whether it was the Missouri River or the Ohio River or the Mississippi River itself or the Arkansas River, all of this flooding that occurred this year has set a recovery number that really does require national involvement. And if we don't recover from these floods, the right kinds of things don't happen. I had a county commissioner tell me over August that the factory doesn't open until the highway opens. And the highway doesn't open until flood protection is guaranteed. And flood protection isn't guaranteed until we appropriate, Mr. President, the money. And we should and appropriately are focused on jobs as the #1 priority in the country today, private sector jobs. But there are a lot of private sector jobs in my state and others that have not been there for months now because the factory's closed or the business is closed, and that factory's not going to open again until people can get to work. And people aren't going to be on the highway to get to work until the levee's rebuilt, and the levee's not going to be rebuilt until the Corps of Engineers has the money to do the job that they're supposed to do and meet their obligations. The Corps' responsible for taking care of some of our most pressing needs, and whether it's restoring the levee at Bird's Point or levees in northwest Missouri and Holt County, which has 165,000 acres, more than half the county, underwater. And a lot of that has been underwater now for 3 or 4 months. I talked to a farmer in my office yesterday who went to his own home for the first time in 3 months by driving a tractor over some fairly high water areas, but passable areas. And his home hadn't been flooded, but everything around it was, so he hadn't been there in 3 months when we talked yesterday until he went this week. And so whether it's water along the entire Missouri River, which has been in flood stage through the month of August, recovering from what's happened on the Mississippi River, we need to do our job. In our case of the Missouri River, this hasn't been a 1 month, 1 week flood, or this is a 3 and 4 month flood. I don't remember a time ever, and in fact, I'm not aware of a time ever when the entire Missouri River from the Missouri border in the northwest corner of the state to St. Louis was in flood stage the entire month of August. And in some cases has been in flood stage now for what is 4 months. Community development block grants that help with disasters provide communities a short-term and long-term way to meet disaster recovery. Disaster community development block grant funds can pick up where FEMA leaves off, and I hope, Mr. President, that's part of our plan as we look for this disaster bill, which I'm intending to support, or the final or another disaster bill that we can agree to with the House, needs to be sure that we make it possible for these communities to do what they couldn't do on their own or couldn't even do with state assistance. In Joplin, things like underground utilities and storm sewers and sanitary systems of all kinds, owner occupancy programs to get people who owned a house but may never own one again because the house they owned, through frankly their own inability or their oversight or their decision not to have insurance. If you own a house and you don't have a loan, there's no banker to tell you you have to get insurance, and we'll have some people that are negatively affected by that, but that was a decision they made. However, getting them into a house that they don't own is something that there are government programs that are designed to help. But community development block grants allows qualifying communities to meet local matches and local needs with a whole lot less red tape than a lot of the other things that the government does. And of course, FEMA funding is with the most recent Hurricane Irene. Suddenly FEMA says, well, I know we made a lot of commitments to other communities that are already in progress, but we now have to turn to the new disaster. And I appreciate turning to the new disaster, but you can't forget that a community has problems they can't deal with that we said we were going to help with just because the TV satellite truck has gone somewhere else. And so I think it's important that FEMA meet its obligations. As I said before, I think it's important that on an ongoing way, we're sure that we have a standard for natural and national disaster that truly is national in scope, with thousands of acres of Missouri farmland still underwater, with communities trying to recover from tornadoes, with commitments that FEMA has told them to move forward on and now suddenly doesn't have the money that they'd already committed. We need to be concerned about that. Programs like the watershed emergency protection and conservation emergency protection that are in this bill that really were in the ag appropriations bill that the committee voted out earlier this week will have a big impact on meeting these obligations. And so, Mr. President, I just say that despite the unprecedented year, my state and Americans everywhere are responding to these disasters, but this is a time when the federal government needs to do what the federal government has said they are there to do. And hopefully we'll do this with this bill or some other bill that comes quickly that allows these communities to meet their needs, these farm families to get back to work, these factory workers to see the factory doors open again. I am supportive of this effort and would yield my time.